everyone, and welcome to the ConTinual Author Spotlight, also known as an Hour With. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. My guest is best-selling author Piper Huguley. In 2015, she was named Debut Author of the Year by Romance Slam Jam and Breakout Author of the Year by African Americans on the Move Book Club. She is a two-time Romance Writers of America Golden Heart Contest finalist. Her first books were historical romance featuring African-American Christian characters. The first two in her Home to Milford College series, The Lawyer's Luck and The Preacher's Promise, were Amazon bestsellers. The third book, A Treasure of Gold, was named by Romance Novels in Color as a best book of 2015. The Preacher's Promise was a Publishers Weekly Top 10 historical romance. A Champion's Heart, part of the Born to Win Men series, was chosen by Sarah McLean for the Washington Post's list of best romance novels in December 2016. A Virtuous Ruby, the first in her Migrations of the Heart series, won the Rose City Romance Writers Golden Rose Contest and was a Romance Writers of America Golden Heart finalist. Piper made her contemporary romance novel debut in 2021 with Sweet Tea for Hallmark Books. Her next release, By Her Own Design, a novel of Ann Lowe, fashion designer to the Social Register, is based on the untold story of Ann Lowe, the Black designer who created Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress. Piper also has a story in the Sunflower Season historical romance anthology To Benefit Ukraine. By the time this recording airs, both books will be available. Welcome, Piper.
Hi, how are you, Nancy?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Fine, nice to be here.
It's good to have you. So let's start at the very beginning, as it were, and talk about what inspired you to start writing.
Well, I am an English professor at Clark Atlanta University now. Prior to that, I taught at Spelman for 13 years. And it's sort of this convergence of two events, one being my son turning 10, and that was the 1 year he ran off to join the football team. So he didn't need me as much anymore, as well as me noticing that the students were not having an understanding of historical events for the time period that's my specialty, which is I like to call it, from Civil War to Civil Rights kind of thing. And I thought if there was something in terms of historical fiction that might engage people in order to come to understand historical events better, but wasn't like heavy reading or anything like that, that might make it a little easier for students to be able to then have that knowledge, to be able to process the literature in a way. And so I knew there were other authors out there who had been writing historical romance, like Beverly Jenkins, as well as other contemporary authors that they enjoyed reading, like Zane. It's very erotic kind of stuff. So I thought to take a different tack in terms of not spicy, but more using romance to show courting rituals of the time period, as it were. So that's how I got started. And because I was at an HBCU, something that had long fascinated me was the history of how the HBCUs came to be in the wake of the Civil War, and how those developed and then maintained themselves in spite of the Reconstruction, as well as the way that the Reconstruction history would be portrayed more as a dark, terrible time as we know it in hindsight, because we know what the end result of the Reconstruction was. But I thought it'd be interesting to write a story standing at the beginning of Reconstruction, when it was a very promising event, when things were beginning to get started. And that's what led me to create Milford College and to write the Home to Milford College series, which I call as a teachers and preachers school, the two occupations that African Americans in the wake of the Civil War were permitted to enter into, to have their own churches and have their own schools. and created a romance around someone who was a preacher in Milford, Georgia, and has a teacher come south. He's expecting a male teacher, but this female comes, and that rubs him in all the wrong, or maybe all the right ways. and they start their romance, and they start the school. So that was when I started to get back into my writing and back in this new iteration as finally thinking of myself as a historical writer. It was something that had long been sort of at the edge of my thought process, but when my son ran off to join the football team, it made me really think about, well, why not take an attempt at writing history? Is something that I had long been interested in. When I look back on my life, I mean, I'm the little kid who was Laura Ingalls Wilder for Halloween one year. My mother said nothing. She went ahead and sewed my little dress and made me a little sunbonnet, and I put it on my afro, and off I went. You know? And I'd been a pilgrim, and I'd been Betsy Ross, and all of this historical stuff all of my life. And I said, well, yes, of course it makes sense that I should write historically. So that was the one series. And then the Migrations of the Heart series, which is kind of loosely based on my paternal grandmother and her sisters. It's about these 5 sisters who make a journey away from their homes north, to go north, from south to the north. The Great Migration, for people who don't know, is the explanation of how Black people moved from being largely Southern and rural to Northern and urban and Western. So to speak. It's the largest internal migration in United States history. And it was another kind of blind spot of history that I saw my students didn't have in terms of trying to make them understand certain text around that time. So yeah, I have these 5 sisters, and each one of them would leave Winslow, Georgia, the town I created, and would move north to Pittsburgh, which is where I'm originally from, and find love in some way. So those are also romances.
Well, you know, it is a lot easier to get people to read novels than straight history.
Yeah. And that was one of my thoughts, to say that it could be people their age, you know, at that, you know, time period, to see the kinds of things they had to go through, whatever, to see the kinds of things they would be doing. That was my thought, that maybe they'd be interested in gaining more historical knowledge that way.
Well, a lot of African American history is obscured. Mm-hmm. You have to really look to find it. Mm-hmm. Is that something you had always been keyed into, or did you start digging when you decided to write these books?
Well, I cheated a little bit because I don't write outside of my time period of expertise. So a lot of this was stuff that I had gained while I was studying for the PhD, in terms of my understanding of figures and events. So that provided a backdrop for the literature, the United States literature that I studied and now subsequently teach. So it's kind of like, it's my subject area, and it's constantly being reinforced and deepened by what I do in the day job. So, you know, other people who are jumping all over the place with their historical time periods, and you know, jumping all over the world, whatever, that's not going to be me. To say, I think there are plenty of stories to tell in this slightly less than 100-year period. That's my wheelhouse. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, in terms of the whole aspect of research, which I know a lot of historical authors are, you know, they're interested in. The thing about it, when writing from the African American point of view, is that you think about research in a different kind of way than the way that it's conventionally taught. Of course, as someone who as a doctorate, taught that conventional way in terms of thinking about research, how to do it, primary and secondary, and all of that other kind of stuff. And that's what I teach my students, particularly if I happen to be teaching composition, so that they're prepared to engage in their studies in the conventional way. But there are other ways in which the people of the past left their thoughts, their mindset, their outlook. And it's almost as if you're going to write in that perspective, then you have to know how to look for those kinds of artifacts and utilize them for writing a historical novel or a historical fiction. So yeah, that's what I make a lot of use of in terms of getting into that historical mindset for my characters. And like I said, it's not the typical approach, in terms of that, but there it is. It's like this, as a librarian told me one time when I was a teenager in Pittsburgh, and I wanted to find some information before I came to understand this. She said, well, newspapers didn't really have much information on Black people at that time period, so it's not really there. Nobody really cared. What she probably didn't understand, or I don't know if she didn't care to understand or whatever, is that, for instance, Black people had their own newspapers that were circulated around the country, and finding those resources, for one thing, might be of help. And there were people who took photographs, and there are photography collections for those newspapers that exist to give you some sense of those things. So there are other ways in terms of finding those things. So, people who, I guess, either aren't into it or don't care enough or whatever, just have to adjust the thought, the thinking in terms of what consists of research for finding out the insights of a marginalized population.
I noticed in By Her Own Design that one of the things you mentioned was that Black Americans were not given honorifics when they were mentioned in the newspaper or in social address. And another author I know who is white was writing a story set in North Carolina in the 1960s, and her character was a reporter. And that was one of the things that she talked about. And it seems to me that and some of the other things that you talked about, like in that book, in By Her Own Design, like having to wait at the store until all the white people had been waited on, are little bits of cultural history that most of us are not aware of.
Yeah.
And how did you find those kinds of tiny little details? Well, I mean, if you've got newspapers, then it would be obvious from reading the newspapers, but things like having to wait at the store and the man at the store deciding what you got to have. I mean, that's just really appalling.
Yeah, it is appalling, but that time period was an appalling time for Black people. Everybody focuses on thinking about enslavement and how horrific it was. And yes, it was, but that whole period in terms of serving as a transition for people to come out of enslavement into some type of freedom. I mean, Douglas Blackmun in Slavery by Another Name, his thesis for that book is that enslavement really didn't come to an end until the 1930s, because of a particular presidential act that Franklin Roosevelt signed. He says, in every way but the conventional name, Black people were still enslaved during much of the time period that I write. Those kinds of things are just the ways in which the machinations of dehumanization were kept moving, right? So again, I lean on my research in terms of my doctorate, And really, in terms of Ann Lowe, in her childhood, by her own design, I had two unconventional sources that I could rely on. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother's family, came from the part of Alabama where Ann Lowe was born and lived for her early years. And so I was very familiar with their stories of what it was like to be a young Black girl at that time period, because of the things that I don't say I was told. I was always poking around and eavesdropping whenever I could get people to talk to me at that time period. A good thing I did, I guess, in terms of understanding those dehumanizing things. And it's interesting because someone like my paternal grandmother didn't necessarily want to, and this is the truth with a lot of older Black people, they're not necessarily forthcoming about the ways in which those things happened. But there were ways of, whenever they would tell a story, or if you would talk about something that happened to you or whatever, it's like just something people usually don't think about very often. We were at the house and at my parents' house, and it was Christmas time, and we were putting logs in the fire. I was like, "Oh, this is so cool!" We're putting like little pine cones in there and watching them burn, and isn't this great or whatever? And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, just looks at us and she's like, "That's fun for you, huh?" Like that having to build a fire thing was a chore for her. It was not fun for her. And so things like that I would glean from the things that she and her sisters, whenever she would get together, we called them the Golden Girls, they would get together and talk. That's when I was really eavesdropping a lot, finding these things out. The other aspect was Zora Neale Hurston, who was my dissertation subject, one of my dissertation subjects, and her autobiography, Dash Tracks on the Road. She was born in a part of Alabama that was another couple of counties that were Ann Lowe wrote at the same time. So yeah, those sort of ways in which imagining and recreating Ann Lowe's childhood helped me to create the story.
For anyone who's not familiar with Zora Neale Hurston, could you just tell us a little bit about her?
She was a writer and anthropologist who was, her birth date crept around a lot because she really didn't want people to know. I happened to visit Eatonville today, which was her hometown. I made my pilgrimage there. And I noticed that in her hometown, they have a plaque there where it says 1890 is her birth year. And I was like, oh my gosh, the deep disrespect. She'd be outraged because she was always claiming 1903 as her year of birth. In terms of that, who wrote about Black people in that particular part of Central Florida via her infamous novel, that's now part of the American literature canon, Their Eyes Were Watching God. People have heard about that. She wrote 3 other novels, a wealth of short stories and essays. And like I said, her training as an anthropologist really came together with her stories, because she used a lot of the folk tales that she collected as material for her stories about Black life in the early part of the 20th century. So my studies with her also assisted in terms of me thinking about Ann Lowe's early years.
We know, speaking about the customs of that period, it's something that Harper Lee alludes to in passing in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think it's one of the coolest episodes in By Her Own Design, which is the controversy on when Ann Lowe went to deliver the wedding dress. Do you mind telling everybody about that?
Yeah, and that's a real life situation. It's not, unfortunately, something that I had to make up. As people who are Southerners know, people who are from the South know that thoughts about bigotry and racism seem to loom large in the Southern context, but they also happen in the North as well, as I make sure to illustrate in several points by her own design about Ann Lowe's story. So this particular one was when it was time for Ann Lowe to deliver the voluminous wedding dress, 50 yards of material that went into that dress, and the bridesmaids' dress, 10 of them. And when she goes to the front door of Hammersmith Farm, which was where the wedding was going to take place, it's Jackie's stepfather's mansion in Rhode Island. The butler didn't want to let her in the front door, and he, as much told her to go around to the back. And Ann Lowe pointedly says, if I have to go into some other entrance around the back door, this wedding dress and these bridesmaids' dresses will not be delivered to the bride and the bridesmaids. And so I have it that she sees Jackie's sister and signals to her, and she's let in instantly in terms of that. So yeah, some of those things, everybody thinks about what happens in the South, but there are things that happen in the North too.
Well, and I think a lot of younger people, especially younger white people, are not necessarily aware that that was the way it was.
Yeah.
That there were doors that said white and doors that said colored for the same establishment.
Yeah.
Water fountains that were similarly labeled. And so it's a time that really lasted for a very long time in American history, but those small things sometimes get lost in the bigger picture of the evolution of civil rights and dealing with issues of racism in our country.
Right.
And so I think people who are not aware of those things will find those parts of the book really interesting because those little bits are scattered.
Yeah. And I've had people from New England tell me when they read those parts, like really made them think about the ways in which racism happened, and that the whole narrative about South bad, North good, is beyond an oversimplification. It's just not true in terms of that. So I was glad to hear that from people.
Yeah. Well, let's backtrack a little because I kind of got us ahead of where we were, but I just think that this is so interesting and that the way that you handled it was so engaging. And so I really wanted to be sure we got to that up front. But how about telling us a little bit about the books in the Milford College series, the individual books and what they involve and kind of what your thinking was when you came up with these stories?
Well, the Milford College series that's published is an ongoing story of a marriage of convenience, as I said, between this preacher and this teacher who came from Oberlin College, where the first Black woman graduate happened prior to the, during the course of the Civil War in 1862, prior to the end of the Civil War. A lot of people don't know that there were rarities, but college-educated Black people that existed before the Civil War ended. Who comes to the South, and she comes across this preacher and in 1866, who's just made mayor of this small Georgia town. And as I said before, he doesn't want a female teacher there. He was looking for a male teacher. The whole aspect of her coming to travel to the South by herself alarmed him greatly. So as the story happens, they enter into this marriage of convenience. And so across these three books is really Virgil and Amanda who have to come to learn and understand one another. And sort of the reason why I did that in that way was because there are various aspects of marriage that change in terms of as people change over time. So, for me to have the same couple across The Preacher's Promise, then the mayor's mission, which deals with voting rights in the wake of the Civil War, after the Civil War happened, and how that occurred, and then concludes with the Representatives' Revolt, which has Virgil and Amanda living in post-Civil War 1872 Atlanta, when the capital city of Georgia was moved, and you have representatives and senators in the Georgia state body who are Black, in terms of what they're representing and what that struggle was like at that particular time period. So it follows them as they're developing their family and really coming to know one another in the wake of different events. So, and they have to learn how to come together and fall in love all over again.
So are they the central characters in all three books?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So it's an anomaly for the romance genre in that
Yes.
you don't have a different front couple every.
Yeah, it is an anomaly in that way. I call it a married people romance, but then I realized like people could take that in a different way. It's like no sexy times, but they are married, and it's just they're changing and evolving over time. The whole aspect of the marriage of convenience, where in A Preacher's Promise, there's someone, I'm not going to spoil it if you want to read it, there's someone who tells them this is a Christian town and you must be married. You cannot be under the same roof not being married. Really means they have to come to know one another as individuals. They're strangers. So yeah, that's how that series develops. And if I may fold in,
Sure.
My contemporary novel, Sweet Tea, is about their 3 times great-granddaughter, who was someone who had forgotten all of that history, and is an intellectual property lawyer in New York City, and calls her grandmother and is shocked to hear that there is someone, a documentarian there, who wants to make a film about her and wants to write a book about her recipes. Recipes are intellectual property. And she wants to represent her grandmother's interests. She's alarmed that that her grandmother would enter into this arrangement with a stranger. But it really is my way of saying, it's an allegory of saying that we don't pay attention to the valuable history and your rich history and culture, if you don't nurture it and you don't pass it along and embody it or whatever, then somebody else will value it and take it away in terms of that. But as it works out, because it's a romance, she's going to fall in love with the documentarian and die. So,
well, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
So there's that happily ever after for the two of them.
Well, it seems like the Great Migration series is more conventional romance stories with a different couple centered.
Yes. That's correct. Each sister gets a different story. So the versus Ruby, the oldest sister, Ruby, is the central character. I think what was a little less conventional about her story is that as a rape victim, she got her happily ever after ending. I remember at the time that it came out, there were a lot of people who were kind of shocked in terms of that whole aspect of her past and what had happened to her, whatever. But I'm of the type where that's the kind of romance I'm going to be writing. My questions around the Milford College, the Migrations of the Heart, was more along lines, what would Prince Charming look like in 1915 if he came to Winslow, Georgia? And so her hero is the town doctor, who happens to be the half-white son of the big man in town, he calls from his medical school education to come and practice there in terms of taking care of the town's African Americans. his sort of their conflict is that Ruby, the heroine, is a midwife. So I put their romance in terms of conflict, which is very important in romance, against the backdrop of the fight between doctors and midwives at that time period, in terms of doctors coming in and taking over what was known as the old time practices of Black women who were midwives. This was their market. They had cornered the market on childbirth and practices for a long, long time. Doctors didn't want to be bothered, but it's right around that time when science became discovered. And there were active campaigns afoot to say that these women were not qualified, they were dirty, and they were unclean. There's a lot of conflict there between the two of them in terms of that historical backdrop. Her sister, Margaret, who's called Mags, falls in love with a reporter who comes to the town. And Mags was a worker in the mill, in the cloth mill that's there in Winslow, Georgia. And he's a former war reporter who comes into work into the mill and to look into their labor practices, and of course upends her work there in the mill. So that's their conflict between the two of them. The third story actually takes place in Pittsburgh after the middle child, Nettie, has visited her sisters, Ruby and Mags, who up here, in A Treasure of Gold. And she falls in love with a kingpin, which is very interesting because Nettie is very, very deeply religious. And so that's their conflict, that she falls in love with this numbers kingpin. The numbers racket, for people who don't know, is that precursor to the lottery that was developed and nurtured in Black communities in the first part of the 20th century, that provided a way for people to get a little bit of a windfall from time to time. And the state comes in and takes it over when they see how lucrative it is. So that's Treasure of Gold. And then the fourth book is A Champion's Heart. So I was considering spinning it off into a new series when it talks about the Born to Win Men series. But the fourth book is about the youngest sister, Dealey, who is a school teacher in Winslow, Georgia. She didn't leave yet. And it's during the Great Depression when, as a school teacher, and these things happened, where people sent their kids to school and just left. They didn't come to get them. She kind of has a couple of foster kids, and she's having to figure out how to get herself and the other sister, the fifth sister, Emerald, to Pittsburgh for a new home and opportunity. She's the last one. They're the last two to finally leave Winslow, Georgia. But she has to rely on the man who left her, who abandoned her at the altar when they were supposed to elope. Get married, he ran off.
That'd be a little bit of a sticky situation.
Well, and that's the conflict, right? So it's a second chance romance, and in terms of that, how is he going to convince her, in terms of getting back together again 7 years later? So that's what that story's about.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you started writing these historical romances as a way to make your students aware of the cultural history that so frequently is obscured. Mm-hmm. But especially with Migrations of the Heart, there are a lot of things you could have written about. Mm-hmm. So why in particular historic Black colleges and universities, and why in particular the Great Migration? What about those two things especially called to you?
Because those were the places where I saw the most, the lack of understanding in terms of that. And what I had kind of suspected at the time, once the stories came out, they hadn't realized, not just pockets of ignorance amongst my students, but in the general culture, in terms of the contributions that Black people had made in terms of thinking about how do we get the sort of the enriching culture in the urban cities of the North and West. It wouldn't have happened without the Great Migration and looking at the reasons why these people were leaving home and making the journey in terms of what they were doing, as well as I said, that golden period of Reconstruction where things were actually going well. And the reason why you get this thought about Reconstruction as such a terrible time is because things were going well and they couldn't have that. So, but one of the lingering benefits that came out of that were the schools, were the historically Black colleges and universities that are still there, that are a legacy, that are unappreciated historical legacy. And that's why I chose them.
Well, to me, when I looked over your book list, the one with the single most intriguing title to me was The Washerwoman's War. Will you tell us about that book?
Well, The Washerwoman's War was a special novella project that I engaged in with 3 other authors as part of a collection called Daughters of a Nation, where it looked at, we knew that the anniversary year to 2020 was coming in terms of the women's right to vote. So we wanted to have a collection of novellas that were centered around how Black women had become politically active in whatever time period we chose, whatever. The Washerwomen's War took place in 1881 in Atlanta, and is credited with being, if not the first, but one of the first labor strikes in the United States. That Black women who at that time were washerwomen, when laundry, and it's like, it always cracks me up when people say they hate doing laundry. Like, I like it because I never failed to appreciate the miraculous nature of putting clothes into one machine and walking away from it and then putting them into another machine. Laundry at that time was an intimate affair in terms of the washerwoman always having to have their hands on the clothes to clean them, to dry them. It was an arduous process that took days and it was something that people who were wealthy and white wanted to, learn out, and they didn't want to pay much for it. And these women stood up and said, no, you have to pay us fairly for this work. So that's why I call it the Washerwoman's War. It's the backdrop is the strike. And something interesting in Atlanta happened at that same time as the strike was the founding of Spelman College, which I always believed that these 2 events had something to do with one another. So the backdrop is this young teacher who goes to Atlanta at the behest of the real life white women who started Spelman College to begin teaching these 11 students the Bible in the basement of the church. And so people think about where Spelman is now as this great, wonderful institution and blah, blah, blah. The Washerwomen's War kind of forces people to to remember it as starting in this basement where there really wasn't a floor, and that there were holes and there were grass spots coming through and other creatures coming through, and that there was just a Bible and a writing implement that started the whole thing. So that's what that novella is all about. And she falls in love. It's a little bit of a second chance with one of the ministers who is behind helping the washerwomen organize their strike that summer. A very impactful summer, the summer of 1881 in Atlanta for those 2 reasons.
Well, you wrote an interesting blog post about the Fisk Jubilee Singers and what you called the 1870s version of a Kickstarter.
Yes.
Tell everyone a little about that.
Well, the body of literary work really is what it is, that we know as the spirituals. James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem called "O Black and Unknown Bards," where he speaks about these spirituals by title. Some people know the Swing Low Sweet Chariot, Steal Away Jesus. Some of these things say there are so many of these songs, hundreds of these songs that were created during enslavement. And we have no idea who wrote these songs, but spoke to the pain of in the thoughts of the composers in terms of the places in the Bible where they saw hope and liberation, whatever. They're a very important resource for thinking about people who've just recently emerged from enslavement, because it's all there in terms of what they were thinking about at that time. So the Fisk Jubilee Singers in the 1870s were just a group that were started by the school within Nashville, Tennessee, to sing both more European stuff to show they could do the showy European stuff, as well as these spirituals. But it was the spirituals that hooked people. And people, began to cry, and they would get more money. So then they developed, more entire concerts around the body of the spirituals, and went all over the world to raise funds. And Fisk has a building there called Jubilee Hall that is there as a consequence of their fundraising money. They sang for Queen Victoria and presidents and whatever, in terms of putting across that spiritual literature in terms of what these unknown bards were concerned with while they were in bondage.
Well, let's move forward into a more modern era, although I wouldn't say By Her Own Design is a thoroughly modern book, because so much of it starts in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. But how did you run across Ann Lowe and get the idea to write a novel about her?
Well, I always knew in the back of my mind is a Black history thing, and I, was someone who had always appreciated the Kennedys and had read a lot about them and everything. I always knew there was this Black woman behind Jacqueline Kennedy's dress, which was a famous dress. It still is to this day. But I hadn't bothered to investigate much about it. But as people know, in terms of social media, one of my favorite social media is Twitter. I was on Twitter and I saw that an editor was looking for historical fiction about Ann Lowe. And so when I look at potential subjects for historical fiction, biographical historical fiction, I'm not always impressed enough for someone's life story to become that kind of novel or that product. But when I bothered to do a little more research on her, I was like, oh yeah, that's for me. I can write a novel about this woman and her trials and triumphs. And she spoke about a very clear goal in her life, that is to show that a Negro could become a fashion designer. And it's that kind of thing that there it is. It's a goal. It provides motivation in terms of writing fiction. I was like, okay, yeah, I can do this. And so I wrote a few pages for that editor, began to work with her in terms of writing By Her Own Design, which I hope that it allows people to realize the contributions that she made, and all, like a lot of Jackie biographies where she's just dismissed as a seamstress or the family seamstress. It seems as if the dress made itself somehow in terms of that. When, she had been someone who had had an ongoing relationship with Jacqueline, her mother, her sister, for a number of years in terms of creating custom bespoke designs for them. So I'm hoping that this brings awareness to that, as well as the intricacy of her process and her work. And one of my ongoing themes that I've always wanted to write about is how do Black women who are not very often permitted access to artistic expression, how do they still find ways to artistically express themselves? And for Ann Lowe, it was in the creations of these dresses and gowns that she made.
You know, it's a very different image of Jacqueline Kennedy than we got in the media during the era when she was so prominent and was everything she did was splashed across front pages and in magazines. This is a much less assertive woman. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was fully aware that the time that I'm writing about her, beginning in 1947, when Anne meets her as a consequence of designing her mother's, Janet Auchincloss's second wedding outfit, that she's not fully developed into that capital J Jackie that is known. So I'm really dealing with, at a point, this young, undeveloped Jacqueline, who is still in this place of emerging from the pain of her parents' divorce and her ongoing contentious relationship with her mother and her adoration of her father, who wasn't always there for her, and thinking of her, portraying her in that way, coming into, as I write it, marriage with, or reaching the goal that Janet Auchincloss always prevailed upon her to engage in, finding a wealthy man and marrying a wealthy man. That was her goal, right? And like when she was engaged the first time, which a lot of people don't necessarily know about that, to John Huston, that he wasn't necessarily someone that Janet Auchincloss thought was good enough for her, that as a Wall Street broker, like her father, she didn't want Jacqueline nor her sister to fall into the difficulties that she had during her marriage with Jacqueline's father. So that engagement broke up, and really shortly thereafter, or some people think, as a consequence of having met John F. Kennedy, her mother kind of assists her, and in terms of bringing a rather reluctant Kennedy to the altar. So yeah, and that's what it's really in terms of engaging in her thought process as that young Jacqueline that I wrote about for much of by her own design, where Ann Lowe has a behind the scenes view of this person in these young years before she becomes a global icon.
And was that based on biography, or was that kind of, as a lot of historical novels are, a combination of biography and logical extrapolation?
Yes, that both of those things. In terms of that, the whole impact of that divorce on her could not be denied, and because of the pain of that divorce between her parents or whatever, she put up with a lot in terms of Jack Kennedy, because she didn't necessarily want her children to be part of that. And there's always that story, which some people are not sure it's apocryphal or not, in terms of she finally did have a point when she had reached her limit, where Jack had been off too much on boats, fishing boats, and had too much of his sexual exploits and all that other kind of stuff, and wanted to leave him. And then Joe Kennedy offers her $1 million or something like that for her to stay. I don't know, but she did stay, which is the the thing. She stayed when like her own mother left, at the thought of what Jack Bouvier had been up to. When I allude to the very famous photograph of that I hope people will take a look, Google, of him holding hands with another woman when Janet is looking to the camera in a different direction. And he's just right there holding hands with another woman. And a photograph was taken. Just incredible.
Yeah. Well, the find a rich husband who can take care of you is kind of paralleled with the advice that Anne's mother and grandmother give her early in her life,
right?
Of find a good white person. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's not entirely unlike that. This is kind of these pieces of advice that I think for anybody who's of a certain age reading this book would be aghast at. But these were the ways in which women, white women, Black women had to survive in terms of that. And it was her mother and her grandmother's belief, deep-seated belief that they put into her to find that white person who's going to support you. And in terms of providing you with a consistent job to much take care of you. It is very much a hangover from enslavement times, in terms of wanting or desiring a good master, which is, makes no sense. There's no such thing as someone as a benevolent slave owner in terms of that. But that was all that those people had in terms of trying to make a life for themselves that allowed them the maximum amount of humanity in the circumstances. So, yeah.
Well, and reading that novel is in some ways similar to reading a good historical biography, because it does take her from small child to the end years of her life. And so you not only had to write about her life and the people in it, but about her world and the changes in her world when she goes from Montgomery to Dothan to Tampa to New York. What kind of research did you do on all these different places at these different eras? How did you kind of bring that together?
Well, sort of when people open up the novel and see that I've dedicated it to a very amazing young scholar, Margaret Powell, who was a textile scholar who did a substantial amount of work on Ann Lowe that provided a wonderful foundation for me. What I do try to think about in terms of historical fiction is the tent poles of fact, where I'm stringing them together with the fictitious conversations and thought process and all of that other kind of stuff. Margaret provided a very important resource there in terms of her thesis, which was, strangely enough, she had gone to Corcoran, which is George Washington University, which is where Jacqueline Kennedy graduated from. In terms of that, it's really kind of interesting little connection there. That all of the research that she had done to that point about Ann Lowe's life really helped. But as a scholar and someone who wants Ann Lowe to take her rightful place in as somewhat of an important contributor, not just in Black history, not to say she should just be celebrated every February, I guess maybe March too, since that's Women's History Month, but year-round in terms of the contributions that she made. One of the things I've long desired and what Margaret was working towards before she had gotten breast cancer at 38 years old and died far too young.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I never met her. I wish I had. In terms of she left behind this wonderful legacy of her thesis, which provided this wonderful foundation for me to use in terms of writing the novel. But that what she was working towards was that comprehensive scholarly biography project that I'm hoping that if Ann Lowe gets her shine, she gets her moment or whatever, that somebody will take that up and finish it in terms of that comprehensive biography. Since I had written the novel, the family, Ann's descendants have stepped forward. They have a lot of material.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yes. They really should be woven into a comprehensive scholarly biography. Margaret had started certain things. She had interviewed people. There are tapes of her interviewing Audrey, her granddaughter, who appears in the book. But there's a lot of other things there in terms of the wealth of information that they have. And I'm hoping that if Anne gets her proper shine, that somebody will be able to get funding, whatever, to take that up and to write that biography that she deserves.
Well, I just have one more question about this book.
Mm-hmm.
You're from Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in an area where I went to high school with Black and white kids from rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
And Ann's family in rural Alabama talks like the kids I went to high school with.
Mm-hmm. And
you're from Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
How did you capture that voice?
Well, twofold. There's, a part of my doctoral studies that dealt with having to study linguistics in part. So there was some of that came into studying my background in terms of what linguists call AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and the way that it varies regionally in terms of rural versus, urban, all that other kind of stuff. Remember, like I said, my grandmother and her sisters were there, coming from a very similar place in Alabama and whatever. So I had the ear to hear them as they talk with one another and stuff. So I was able to use those two factors to extrapolate, the way in which the sound would come through, and the whole aspect of that I think is interesting. Some people are getting the notions of in terms of there's certain speech patterns that Anne has when she's with certain people and the ones that she doesn't, right? Black people are very practiced at code switching in terms of changing their speech depending upon their circumstance, and who they're speaking to, and where they are, and all of that other kind of stuff. So I was glad to see people being able to pick up on that. When it's really in abeyance of what fiction writers are told, right? There's this whole aspect of you assign sound to certain characters. But what I wanted was that for those speech patterns to resonate with her Alabama upbringing, but also to be appropriate when she's in circumstances with these upper white class women at the social register.
Right. So. And that book was just tapped by the Washington Post as one of the 10 books to read this summer, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, that's cool. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, we have one more project we haven't talked about at all, and that's the Sunflower Season anthology. Will you tell us about that?
Yes, 70 plus writers of historical fiction have gotten together to have an anthology of historical fiction that has not been published before in any other place to raise money for Ukraine. So it is for a good cause. Every cent of that $7.99 people pay for that very large anthology, upwards of like 2,000 pages of historical fiction will go for Ukraine efforts. And my novella in that is it's a novella that I wrote some time ago, put to the side. It's called The Sweetest Chocolate Drop, which is a second chance romance that takes place in Pittsburgh in 1952 of a World War II veteran and a nightclub singer who has a daughter who had polio. And the nightclub singer and her daughter come across this World War II veteran when she has to be put into what was called at the time, it's not politically correct, right? It's called the Crippled Children's Home, where he is an orderly and he encounters his past love again. And so they have to come to terms with one another. And of course, the secret baby story in terms of the little girl and what she requires and how they could possibly come together to make a family. So it's a little loosely based on another story who had polio as a child. So
70 stories for $7.99.
Yeah.
That's almost not like a box set, but like a steamer trunk set.
Yes, exactly. Well, one of the things they try to impress on people was to try to write short. You know, people are about to like throw whole novels in there. It's like, you can't do that, dude. You know, it's like keep it to like less than 20K words, you know. So some people teamed up and wrote something new, and you know, and other people had other things like me that had been on the hard drive they put forward. But yeah. So it should be interesting when it comes out.
And that's like really soon. That's like,
yeah, it's also on June 7th, which is the same day as By Her Own Design comes out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, is there anything that we have not talked about that you would like to talk about?
I'm just hopeful that people take the plunge with By Her Own Design. I don't want people to think of it as some kind of spinach where it's like, oh, this is home oppression and woe or whatever. It really is a story of inspiration and hope and what it means when someone has a dream and they just will not let it go, despite all circumstances. I think, as you know, a lot of people fell by the wayside and pursued this dream to be a fashion designer. And yeah, that's what I hope. It's for women, it's for men, it's for everybody who, like I said, falls into that category of what it means to have a dream and not give up on it.
Yeah, and she was eventually listed in the social register, wasn't she?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So,
I mean,
yeah,
I don't know much about that world, but that would seem to me to be a symbol of having made it.
Right. Exactly. From her perspective. Definitely. Listed in the social register, and as my editor, when she was wanting to buy the story and everything, said, what would be the hope in terms of and realizing that she had achieved her dream. And I had the knowledge of that very early, and it's something that it really actually happened in her life, which is why I said all of these things in terms of her story, there were some things that I had to fictionalize or whatever, but there were other things, so many of them that were right there. It was really an extraordinary life. But much of which, and this is very nerdy, but I do have to say it, is, Nancy, as a fiction writer, there's always this ongoing struggle about prologues and what to do with them and all this other kind of stuff. But the prologue was the very, very first thing that I wrote, because it occurred to me when Ann Lowe died, that she died on the day after Charles and Diana got engaged. So I knew that she would be looking at that as someone. I don't know if she was, alive or conscious or whatever, but made her be conscious to be able to have this realization somebody was going to get a great commission in terms of the wedding that at that time people had been waiting for. Everybody's like, what is wrong with Charles and when is he going to get married? Kind of attitude that people had in the late 70s and early 80s. And that a lot of people have said that it's kind of an exemplary prologue. But if you're going to do a prologue, this is the kind of prologue that. So I'm glad. It was my first prologue. So
yeah,
I was glad.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Piper, thank you so much for joining me and talking to me this afternoon. Would you like to tell the Pipples where they can find your website and information about your work?
Sure. My website is piperhuguley.com, piperhuguley.com. And my social media, Twitter @Piper Huguley, Instagram, which I'm becoming to know more, is Piper_Huguley, and Facebook is Piper G Huguley. There is one that's Piper Huguley as well. I'm just not as much as engaged as with the Piper G Huguley account in terms of that. And that is where I can be found.
Well, Piper.
Oh, I think also the Institute is something in terms of events. So I know there's
oh yes,
yeah, the event, some pointed events, which I'm going to be doing a lot of this summer, but some pointed events. On June 23rd, I'll be in conversation in Decatur, the First Church of Decatur, with Louis Bayard, who wrote another Jackie adjacent book called Jackie and Me, which is his novel through the viewpoint of Lem Billings, who is the gay best friend of JFK. And so we'll be talking with one another about our various Jackies, I think, as it were. And I'll also be in conversation on June 17th with Wanda Williams at Foxtail Books in Woodstock, Georgia. But yeah, look at my website and follow me on social media, and I'll be letting you know all of the places that I'll be appearing and signing this summer into the fall for By Her Own Design.
Great. Well, thank you again, Piper, and thank you to everyone who's watching.
Thank you.